You didn't hesitate to stab your king in the back, you just made sure the French got the blame. Welcome to Brutal History for Sleep, where we gently tuck you in with treachery and torchlight. If you enjoy falling asleep to betrayal and passive-aggressive coronations, don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and what hour the idea of conquest usually curls up in your brain. Tonight you kill a Viking, crown yourself, and then lose everything to a Frenchman with a better army and a more convincing sword collection. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of your own breath, the way your chest rises and falls in time with the fire's soft crackle. The blankets are heavy, warm and far too clean for what you've done. Your fingers twitch, your jaw tightens. You're not cold, you're remembering. Now, imagine the scent of tallow and damp wool. Picture the flickering torchlight licking the stone walls of Westminster. Outside, someone sharpens a blade. Horses shift. In Normandy, sails are being stitched. You made yourself king, and someone else is coming to fix that. Edward the Confessor was not what you'd call a typical medieval king. While most monarchs of his era were busy conquering neighbours, executing rivals, or at the very least producing an heir or 12, Edward spent his reign in quiet contemplation, prayer, and what can only be described as aggressive celibacy. Edward was pious in the way that makes your grandmother look like a casual churchgoer. He attended Mass multiple times daily, founded abbeys with the enthusiasm most people reserve for shopping, and apparently found the idea of physical intimacy about as appealing as a plague outbreak. His marriage to Edith of Wessex was, by all accounts, a political arrangement that remained diplomatically unconsummated, because nothing says divine kingship quite like avoiding your royal duties in every possible sense. Now you might think that a king who spent 24 years on the throne would have found 5 minutes to address the small matter of succession, but Edward seemed to operate under the medieval equivalent of someone else will figure it out. He was the royal equivalent of leaving a group project until the last minute. Except the group project was the future of England, and the deadline was his death. Edward had grown up in exile in Normandy, because naturally his family had their own succession crisis a generation earlier. Ah yes, the classic medieval cycle: flee to Normandy, return with Norman friends, die without an heir, repeat. During his Norman years, Edward had developed close ties with Duke William, a relationship that would later prove problematic. William would claim that Edward had promised him the English throne, though whether this was an actual promise or just Edward being politely vague is lost to history. You know how it is with promises. They're like medieval contracts, except nobody can read and everyone's already dead. As Edward's health declined in late 1065, the succession question loomed like storm clouds over a medieval harvest. And, speaking of harvests, Edward had managed to reap exactly 0 heirs after decades of marriage. The English nobility began to eye each other with the sort of sideways glances usually reserved for the last piece of bread during a famine. The most obvious candidate was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, who had essentially been running England while Edward spent his time building Westminster Abbey and avoiding his wife. Harold was competent, experienced, and possessed the rare medieval qualification of not being actively insane. He was Edward's brother-in-law, which in a world where family trees looked more like family shrubs, was close enough to legitimate. But Harold faced a small problem. William of Normandy believed he had a better claim. According to William, and William was very chatty about this, Edward had promised him the throne during one of those lovely Norman visits. Even better, William claimed that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's claim, probably while admiring some lovely Norman tapestries, and definitely under what modern lawyers would call duress. The oath incident was peak medieval politics. Harold had supposedly been captured during a fishing expedition gone wrong, because of course Harold would get kidnapped while fishing, and William had graciously rescued him. In return for this hospitality, William extracted a holy oath from Harold to support his claim to the English throne. Harold swore on sacred relics, which in medieval terms was like signing your name in blood while your mother watched disapprovingly. Now, Harold later claimed he had no choice but to swear the oath, and that promises made while essentially being held hostage didn't really count. William disagreed, with the sort of disagreement that involves building a fleet and sharpening a lot of swords. The concept of oath-breaking in medieval times was serious business. the sort of thing that got you excommunicated, which was like being blocked on social media, except with eternal damnation. Meanwhile, lurking in the Nordic shadows was Harald Hardrada of Norway, whose approach to succession law was refreshingly simple. I want it, I have an army, therefore it's mine. Hardrada based his claim on a previous agreement between Magnus of Norway and Harthacnut of Denmark, which had promised that if either died without an heir, the other would inherit their kingdoms. Since Harthacnut had been king of England before Edward, Hardrada argued that this made him the rightful king. It was genealogical mathematics that only made sense if you squinted really hard and had recently suffered a head injury. Hardrada was the sort of Viking who made other Vikings nervous. He'd spent years fighting in various exotic locations, accumulating wealth, enemies and scars in roughly equal measure. His nickname was Hardrada, which meant hard ruler, because apparently the tall, frightening man with boundary issues was too long for medieval branding purposes. As 1065 turned into 1066, Edward's health continued its gentle decline toward the inevitable. The king spent his final months in a haze of religious devotion and what can charitably be called selective awareness of the brewing succession crisis. He was like a medieval ostrich, except instead of burying his head in sand, he buried it in prayer books. On January 5, 1066, Edward finally departed this earthly realm, presumably to explain to various saints why he'd left England's future about as organised as a Viking's raid on a monastery. His death was peaceful, which was more than could be said for what was about to happen to his kingdom. The moment Edward breathed his last, Harold Godwinson moved with the sort of speed usually reserved for escaping burning buildings. Within hours of Edward's death, Harold had convinced the Witan, England's Council of Nobles, who functioned like a medieval parliament, if parliament consisted entirely of armed men with strong opinions, to elect him king. The very next day, January 6th, Harold was crowned at Westminster Abbey, making his coronation almost as swift as his political manoeuvring. Harold's coronation was swift, decisive, and slightly desperate. He understood that in medieval succession, possession really was 9/10 of the law, and the other 10th was whoever had the sharpest sword. By grabbing the crown immediately, Harold hoped to present his rivals with a fait accompli, the medieval equivalent of calling shotgun on the throne. But across the Channel, William of Normandy was not taking the news well. When William heard that Harold had been crowned, his reaction was reportedly spectacular, involving thrown furniture and language that would have made a Viking blush. William immediately began planning what he called a righteous expedition to claim his throne, though righteous in Norman terms usually translated to involving a lot of burning. William's preparations were thorough and theatrical. He sent envoys to the Pope, explaining his case with the sort of detailed legal arguments that medieval churchmen found irresistible. The Pope, either convinced by William's righteousness or impressed by his donation potential, granted papal approval for the invasion. This meant that William would be fighting under the banner of Holy War, which was excellent for morale and even better for recruitment. Meanwhile, in Norway, Harald Hardrada heard about Edward's death and Harold's coronation with the sort of keen interest a shark shows in bleeding fish. Hardrada began assembling his own invasion force, because why should William have all the fun? Norway's approach to international law was simpler than Normandy's, less papal approval, more axes. And so, as spring arrived in 1066, England faced the medieval equivalent of a hostile takeover bid. Harold sat on his newly acquired throne, probably not sleeping very well, while two separate invasion forces prepared to explain to him why his coronation had been premature. It was the sort of situation that made medieval kings nostalgic for simpler problems, like plague outbreaks or dragon sightings. The stage was set for what would become the most consequential year in English history, when three armies would settle the succession crisis in the traditional medieval way, with pointed sticks and elaborate tactical misunderstandings. Edward the Confessor, in his infinite piety, had created a situation that would require divine intervention to resolve peacefully. Unfortunately, the divine seemed to be taking a coffee break, leaving earthly resolution to men with an unseemly fondness for violence and very strong opinions about oath-keeping. Harold would spend the summer of 1066 looking nervously at both horizons, waiting to see which invasion would arrive first. Little did he know that he'd get to enjoy both, in what would become the ultimate medieval stress test. because nothing says challenging reign quite like facing two separate Viking-style expressions of disapproval in the same season. The die was cast, the armies were gathering, and somewhere in the afterlife, Edward the Confessor was probably having a quiet word with the appropriate saints about the importance of succession planning. But saints, like medieval kings, work in mysterious ways, and their solution to England's problem would involve significantly more bloodshed than prayer. Spring and summer of 1066 passed with the sort of tense anticipation usually reserved for waiting to see which of your medieval neighbours would burn your village this year. Harold Godwinson spent these months in a state of royal anxiety, constantly checking the horizons, and probably developing what modern psychiatrists would recognise as severe performance anxiety. He knew invasions were coming, he just didn't know when, where, or in what order. Harold's strategy was to keep his army assembled along the southern coast, eyes fixed on Normandy, where William was building ships with the methodical enthusiasm of someone planning a very permanent vacation. The English fleet patrolled the Channel, and Harold stationed troops at likely landing sites, creating the medieval equivalent of a neighbourhood watch programme. Except the neighbours were French, and the crime they were preventing was conquest. But Harald Hardrada of Norway had been watching this southern focus with the sort of calculating interest that made other Vikings proud. While everyone's attention was fixed on the Channel, Hardrada quietly assembled his own invasion force in the north, because the best way to crash a party is through the back door, especially when the back door is unguarded and leads directly to someone else's kingdom. Hardrada's timing was impeccable, which is to say spectacularly inconvenient for Harold. In September 1066, just as Harold's southern watch was wearing thin, and his troops were starting to wonder if the Normans had gotten lost, Hardrada sailed up the River Ouse with a fleet that reportedly stretched for miles. The sight of 300 longships appearing in Yorkshire probably gave the local population the sort of surprise usually reserved for tax collectors or biblical plagues. Hardrada wasn't travelling alone. He'd brought with him Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, in what represented either the ultimate family betrayal or the medieval equivalent of a particularly bitter divorce proceeding. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria until the previous year, when his subjects had expressed their dissatisfaction with his leadership through the traditional method of violent rebellion. Harold, being a reasonable brother and king, had chosen not to support Tostig's reinstatement, which Tostig had taken about as well as you'd expect. Nothing says family bonding like fratricide and exile. Tostig had spent his banishment plotting revenge with the sort of dedication usually reserved for monks copying manuscripts. His alliance with Hardrada was the medieval equivalent of calling your scary friend to deal with your siblings, except the scary friend was a 6'6" Viking king with anger management issues, and the siblings controlled England. The Norwegian invasion force was impressive in the way that natural disasters are impressive. Hardrada brought approximately 15,000 men, which in medieval terms represented a significant percentage of Norway's total population who weren't currently busy fishing or avoiding bears. The fleet was so large that contemporary sources claimed it took all day to pass any given point on the river, like a very violent parade, with significantly more weapon. Hardrada's reputation preceded him like a particularly ominous shadow. He was known throughout Scandinavia as the Thunderbolt of the North, which was either a fearsome nickname or evidence that medieval branding consultants had gotten dramatically out of hand. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, which in an age where most people topped out around 5.5 feet, made him roughly equivalent to a mobile siege tower with personality issues. The Norwegian army landed at Rikal and immediately began doing what Viking armies did best, making their presence known through creative property redistribution. They moved inland with the casual confidence of tourists who'd forgotten to book accommodation but brought their own weapons to encourage hospitality. Local resistance crumbled faster than a poorly built castle wall. The Earls of Northumbria, Edwin and Morcar, assembled what forces they could and met the Norwegians at Fulford Gate on September 20th. The battle was brief, decisive and thoroughly educational for anyone who'd forgotten why Vikings had such an impressive reputation for vacation planning. The English earls approached the battle with the sort of optimism usually reserved for people who'd never actually met Vikings in person. Edwin and Morcar had assembled a respectable force, but respectable and Viking-proof were two entirely different concepts. The Battle of Fulford Gate lasted about as long as it takes to explain why fighting Vikings on their terms is generally inadvisable. Hardrada's forces demolished the English resistance with clinical efficiency. Edwin and Morcar survived, but their armies didn't, and the survivors learned the important lesson that Norwegian hospitality was significantly different from the brochures. The earls retreated to lick their wounds and probably reconsider their career choices, while Hardrada celebrated by demanding tribute from York and generally making himself at home in northern England. York's capitulation was swift and pragmatic. The city fathers took one look at Hardrada's army and decided that civic pride was considerably less important than civic survival. They agreed to provide hostages and supplies, which, in medieval diplomacy, was the equivalent of leaving out milk and cookies for a very large, very armed Santa Claus. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson received news of the Norwegian invasion with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for bubonic plague outbreaks. He was still watching the southern coast for William's invasion, maintaining his defensive positions against the Normans, when messengers arrived with the delightful news that his brother had brought a Viking army to visit Yorkshire. Harold's response was characteristic. He moved fast, complained later. Within days, he'd assembled his available forces and begun marching north at a pace that would have impressed Olympic athletes and probably killed medieval horses. The march from London to Yorkshire covered approximately 200 miles, which Harold's army completed in roughly 4 days. This was the medieval equivalent of speed walking while carrying heavy weapons and maintaining a positive attitude about family reunions. The forced march was brutal even by medieval standards. Harold's troops covered ground at a rate that suggested they'd either discovered performance-enhancing herbs or were motivated by the sort of desperate energy that comes from knowing that Viking armies don't typically send polite farewell cards when they finish visiting. Harold's army was a mixture of professional soldiers and hastily assembled militia, united by their shared enthusiasm for not being conquered by Norwegians. The professional troops were Harold's housecarls, elite warriors who'd trained specifically for the sort of close-quarters violence that Vikings considered recreational. The militia were farmers, craftsmen, and various other civilians who'd suddenly discovered that military service was considerably more urgent than their regular occupations. As Harold's exhausted army approached Yorkshire, Hardrada was enjoying the fruits of conquest with the sort of relaxed confidence that comes from recently winning a decisive victory. The Norwegian king had established his headquarters and was making plans for the administrative details of his new English territories, presumably including tax collection and the installation of appropriate Nordic bureaucracy. On September 25th, Harold's army reached the vicinity of Stamford Bridge, where intelligence reports placed the Norwegian forces. Hardrada, it seemed, had divided his army, leaving some troops with the ships at Rickhall while taking others to collect tribute and hostages from various nearby settlements. It was the sort of tactical decision that made perfect sense, until someone pointed out that it left the army vulnerable to being defeated in detail. The Battle of Stamford Bridge began with what can only be described as maximum surprise and optimal timing. Harold's approach had been swift and stealthy enough that the Norwegians were caught in the medieval equivalent of their pyjamas, except medieval pyjamas involved considerably more armour and significantly fewer Vikings actually wearing it. The initial English assault was devastating. Harold's forces hit the Norwegian positions like a medieval freight train, catching Hardrada's men while they were scattered and only partially equipped for serious fighting. Many of the Norwegians had left their armour with the ships, presumably because Yorkshire in September was too warm for full mailcoats, which proved to be an unfortunate miscalculation. Hardrada himself was caught in the sort of tactical disadvantage that made other kings nervous about taking vacations in England. He attempted to rally his forces while simultaneously calling for reinforcements from the ships at Rickhall, which was roughly 11 miles away. In medieval communication terms, this was like sending a text message via trained messenger pigeon during a house fire. The battle quickly developed into the sort of chaotic violence that made battlefield surgeons wealthy and army chaplains nervous. The Norwegians fought with the desperate courage of people who'd suddenly realized that their brilliant invasion plan had developed some unexpected complications. The English attacked with the focused fury of people defending their homeland against uninvited guests who'd overstayed their welcome and broken the furniture. Harold Hardrada died in the battle, struck down while attempting to coordinate his scattered forces. His death was appropriately dramatic, involving multiple weapons, and what contemporary sources described as great valour, which was medieval code for he went down swinging. The death of their king had the predictable effect on Norwegian morale, which plummeted faster than a dropped Viking shield. Tostig Godwinson also fell at Stamford Bridge, ending his brief career as a professional brother betrayer. His death solved Harold's family problem in the traditional medieval way, permanently and with witnessed violence. The surviving Norwegians retreated toward their ships, pursued by English forces who'd developed strong opinions about Nordic tourism. The Norwegian retreat became a rout, which became a historical footnote about why invasion planning should include contingency scenarios for unexpected royal visits. The survivors who reached the ships found themselves explaining to their compatriots back home why their conquest of England had lasted approximately 5 days and ended with most of their army buried in Yorkshire soil. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Norwegian invasion force to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. This represented either efficient fleet management or a dramatic illustration of the risks involved in medieval international relations. The surviving Norwegians departed with the sort of haste usually associated with escaping creditors, carrying news of Hardrada's death and cautionary tales about English hospitality. Harold's victory was complete, decisive and perfectly timed to create maximum complications for his immediate future. He'd eliminated the Norwegian threat and dealt with his family's internal politics, but the victory celebration was interrupted by news that would have tested the patience of a saint. William of Normandy had finally finished his preparations and was crossing the Channel. The messenger who brought news of William's landing probably received the sort of royal reception usually reserved for people announcing tax increases during harvest season. Harold, fresh from one victory and already exhausted from his Yorkshire sprint, learned that his real problems were just beginning. The Norman invasion had begun while he was cleaning up Norwegian tourism, which was the medieval equivalent of discovering your house was on fire while you were busy fixing a leaky roof. Harold's army, victorious but tired, faced the prospect of another forced march, this time back south to deal with Norman visitors who'd arrived without invitation. The men who'd just finished explaining to Vikings why England wasn't available for conquest would now need to provide similar instruction to Normans, who had their own ideas about English hospitality and significantly better legal documentation. The victory at Stamford Bridge was complete, but its timing ensured that Harold would face William's invasion with a depleted, exhausted army that had already spent its energy on Scandinavian customer service. It was the sort of tactical situation that made medieval kings nostalgic for simpler problems, like succession crises or family feuds that didn't involve international military intervention. As Harold began planning his march south, he probably reflected that kingship was considerably more complicated than the job description had suggested. He'd successfully defended England against one invasion, only to discover that invasions, like problems with medieval plumbing, rarely came alone. The Norman threat awaited, and with it, the battle that would determine whether Harold's rapid response to the Norwegian invasion had been a brilliant tactical victory or an expensive prelude to conquest. While Harold was up in Yorkshire teaching Norwegians about English customs through interpretive violence, William of Normandy was putting the finishing touches on what he liked to call his righteous expedition, and everyone else called that massive invasion fleet currently gathering at the mouth of the River Deve. William's preparations had been thorough, in the way that only comes from having several months to plan, unlimited motivation, and the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that made other medieval rulers nervous about Norman administrative capabilities. He'd spent the summer of 1066 building ships, recruiting allies, and collecting papal documentation, because William believed strongly in both overwhelming force and proper paperwork. The papal blessing had been a particular coup. Pope Alexander II had reviewed William's case like a medieval Supreme Court justice, examining the evidence of Edward's promise, Harold's oath, and various other legal details that sounded impressive when written in Latin. The Pope's decision to support William's claim transformed the invasion from simple conquest into a holy war, which was excellent for recruitment and even better for international relations. Armed with papal approval, William found that recruitment became significantly easier. Norman nobles who might have hesitated to support a dynastic adventure were suddenly enthusiastic about participating in a religious crusade, especially one that promised English land grants as compensation for their spiritual service. Nothing motivated medieval warriors quite like the combination of heavenly approval and earthly profit margins. But William's army wasn't entirely Norman. His recruitment efforts had attracted volunteers from across northern France, creating what amounted to a pan-European expedition with Norman management. Bretons, Flemish, French, and various other nationalities joined the invasion force, drawn by promises of land, loot, and the sort of career advancement opportunities usually associated with successful conquest. The invasion fleet was impressive by any medieval standard. Contemporary sources suggest that William assembled between 400 and 700 ships, which represented either careful historical record-keeping or the medieval equivalent of generous estimation. The ships ranged from purpose-built warships to hastily converted merchant vessels, creating a fleet that looked like the result of a medieval maritime emergency requisition order. Loading the ships presented unique logistical challenges. William needed to transport not just soldiers but horses, supplies, and the sort of siege equipment that made castle owners nervous. Medieval horses were not enthusiastic about sea travel, and convincing several hundred destriers to board ships required the sort of patient negotiation usually reserved for hostage situations. The horses were crucial to Norman tactical doctrine. Norman heavy cavalry was the medieval equivalent of tank warfare, combining armoured knights with trained warhorses to create a mobile striking force that could break infantry formations through a combination of speed, weight, and pointed objects. Without their horses, Norman knights were just very expensive infantry with balance issues. William's timing had been delayed by weather, logistics, and the sort of minor complications that made medieval invasion planning resemble modern event coordination, except with more weapons and fewer catering concerns. The original plan had called for an August invasion, but contrary winds, supply problems, and the time needed to bless all those ships properly had pushed the departure into late September. The delay had actually worked in William's favour, though he probably didn't appreciate it at the time. Harold's attention had been focused on the Channel throughout the summer, but the Norwegian invasion had forced him to march north, leaving the southern coast less heavily defended precisely when William was finally ready to sail. On September 28th, 2 days after Harold's victory at Stamford Bridge, William's fleet finally crossed the Channel. The crossing was accomplished without significant incident, which, in medieval naval terms, meant that most of the ships arrived, with most of their passengers still aboard and relatively dry. The horses were probably less enthusiastic about the journey, but medieval transportation rarely prioritised passenger comfort. The landing at Pevensey was unopposed, which must have come as something of a relief to invasion planners who'd spent months preparing for contested beach warfare. The Norman fleet arrived to find the sort of welcoming committee usually reserved for merchant vessels, absolutely no one with weapons, and strong opinions about unauthorised visitors. William's first act upon landing was reportedly to stumble and fall flat on his face in the sand, which his followers initially interpreted as either a bad omen or evidence that their duke had developed sudden tactical incompetence. William quickly turned the moment into propaganda gold by grabbing handfuls of English sand and declaring that he was taking possession of his rightful inheritance, medieval spin control at its finest. When life gives you faceplants, make them into symbolic gestures of legitimate authority. The Norman landing proceeded with the methodical efficiency that characterised William's entire approach to conquest. Troops disembarked, horses were unloaded with varying degrees of cooperation, and supplies were organised with the sort of systematic precision that suggested someone had actually thought about what happens after you invade a country. William's first priority was establishing a secure base of operations. The Normans began constructing fortifications at Pevensey, using prefabricated wooden sections they'd brought across the Channel. This was medieval flat-pack architecture, conquest-ready fortifications that could be assembled with minimal tools and maximum speed, assuming you had the instruction manual and nobody was shooting arrows at you. The speed of Norman fortification was impressive even by contemporary standards. Within days of landing, William had established a fortified bridgehead that could serve as a supply base, retreat point, and administrative centre for his new English territories. The Normans had essentially built themselves a medieval version of a forward operating base, complete with defensive positions, and probably better sanitation than most English towns. From Pevensey, William moved his forces to Hastings, where he established a second fortification and began the systematic process of making his presence known throughout the surrounding countryside. This involved what medieval chroniclers politely called foraging, which was essentially organized requisitioning of local resources without particularly detailed paperwork or explicit permission from the previous owners. The Norman foraging operations served multiple purposes beyond simple supply acquisition. They demonstrated William's power to the local population, encouraged cooperation through practical example, and sent a clear message to Harold that the invasion was serious, well supplied, and not planning to leave voluntarily. Medieval psychological warfare was often surprisingly subtle, assuming your definition of subtle included burning villages and redistributing livestock. Local resistance to Norman foraging was minimal, partly because organized resistance requires organization, and the sudden appearance of several thousand foreign soldiers tends to disrupt normal administrative procedures. The inhabitants of Sussex found themselves providing involuntary hospitality to Norman forces while waiting to see how their new international relations would develop. William's strategy during this period was carefully calculated. He could have advanced inland immediately, seeking to capture London or force a quick, decisive battle. Instead, he remained near the coast, fortifying his positions and systematically devastating the local countryside. This approach served to draw Harold south, while ensuring that William maintained secure lines of communication with Normandy. The devastation of Sussex was thorough and purposeful. William's forces destroyed crops, seized livestock, and generally made the cost of continued resistance clear to anyone who might be considering it. The Bayeux Tapestry, which serves as our most detailed visual record of the invasion, depicts Norman soldiers engaged in enthusiastic property redistribution, suggesting that medieval documentation sometimes captured more truth than contemporary political statements. Meanwhile, news of the Norman landing reached Harold while he was still celebrating his victory over the Norwegians. The messenger who brought this intelligence probably received the sort of royal reception usually reserved for people announcing the simultaneous outbreak of plague and famine. Harold learned that while he'd been solving his Norwegian problem, his Norman problem had developed from theoretical to extremely practical. William had landed 3 days after Stamford Bridge. Timing that seemed almost supernatural in its inconvenience. Harold's response was characteristically decisive and probably insufficiently contemplative. He immediately began organizing a march south, gathering what forces he could, while sending word for additional troops to meet him along the way. The king, who'd just completed a forced march to Yorkshire, now faced the prospect of an immediate forced march back to Sussex, which was the medieval equivalent of running a marathon followed immediately by another marathon, except with more armour and higher stakes. The English army that began marching south was a mixture of Harold's surviving housecarls from Stamford Bridge and hastily assembled militia forces drawn from the southern counties. Many of Harold's best troops were still in Yorkshire, either dead, wounded, or simply too exhausted to maintain the pace of rapid redeployment. Harold was essentially improvising a new army while marching toward a battle that would determine the future of England. Harold's haste was understandable but strategically questionable. A more cautious approach might have involved gathering larger forces, allowing time for recovery from the Norwegian campaign, and developing a more comprehensive strategy for dealing with Norman tactical advantages. Instead, Harold chose speed over preparation, possibly calculating that delay would allow William to strengthen his position and potentially receive reinforcements from Normandy. The march south took Harold's forces through London, where the king made a brief stop to gather additional troops and probably wonder why succession crises always seem to involve so much walking. London provided some reinforcements, but not enough to replace the losses from Stamford Bridge, or compensate for the exhaustion of continuous campaigning. As Harold's army approached Sussex, William received intelligence reports about English movements with the sort of professional interest that suggested Norman reconnaissance was functioning effectively. William's scouts provided detailed information about Harold's approach, allowing the Norman Duke to prepare for battle while maintaining his strategic position near the coast. William's decision to remain near Hastings was tactically sound but politically risky. By staying in Sussex, he maintained secure communications with Normandy and avoided the complications of operating far from his base of supply. However, this strategy also allowed Harold to choose the time and place of battle, which could prove disadvantageous if Harold selected his ground carefully. The stage was now set for the confrontation that both sides had been anticipating, since Edward the Confessor's inconvenient death. Harold approached with an army exhausted by continuous campaigning but experienced in recent victory. William waited with fresh troops, superior equipment, and the sort of tactical advantages that came from having months to prepare for this exact situation. The two armies were about to engage in what would become the most consequential battle in English history, fought between a Saxon king defending his recently acquired crown and a Norman duke claiming his divinely appointed inheritance. Both sides were confident, well-motivated, and equipped with the sort of medieval weapons that made battlefield surgeons wealthy and battlefield casualties numerous. Neither commander could have known that they were about to participate in one of history's genuine turning points, where the outcome of a single day's fighting would determine whether England remained Saxon or became Norman, whether the language of government would be English or French, and whether medieval castle architecture would remain a theoretical concern or become a very practical reality throughout the English countryside. The armies were moving toward each other across the Sussex countryside, carrying with them the hopes, ambitions, and strategic miscalculations that would reshape English history. Harold marched south with the desperate energy of a king defending his crown. William waited with the patient confidence of a duke claiming his inheritance. Between them lay a field near Hastings, where medieval political science would be settled through traditional methods, pointed weapons and tactical creativity. October 14th, 1066, dawned with the sort of crisp autumn weather that would have been perfect for harvesting crops, hunting deer, or any number of peaceful medieval activities that didn't involve several thousand men trying to kill each other with sharp implements. Instead, it became the morning when England's future would be decided through interpretive violence and tactical innovation. Harold's army had spent the night camped on Caldbeck Hill, about 6 miles from Hastings, which gave them the medieval equivalent of a restless night before final exams, except the exam was conducted with swords, and failure meant death rather than academic disappointment. Harold had chosen his position carefully, selecting ground that would force William to attack uphill against prepared defences, which was the sort of tactical advantage that medieval commanders appreciated when they could get it. The English position was on Senlac Hill, a ridge that provided excellent defensive terrain and commanding views of the surrounding countryside. Harold's forces controlled the high ground, which in medieval warfare was roughly equivalent to holding all the good cards in a particularly violent poker game. The slope was steep enough to tire attacking forces, but not so steep as to prevent effective defensive archery, assuming you had archers who hadn't been left behind in Yorkshire. Harold's army formation was classic Anglo-Saxon tactical doctrine, a shield wall. This was exactly what it sounds like, a line of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a continuous barrier that resembled a medieval version of riot control, except with more axes and considerably higher stakes. The shield wall was anchored by Harold's housecarls, professional warriors who'd trained specifically for this sort of close-quarters violence, and probably considered it a normal workday. The housecarls were equipped with the famous Danish long axe, weapons that could cleave through armour, shields, and whatever else happened to be in the way when wielded by someone with appropriate professional training. These axes were the medieval equivalent of power tools, efficient, versatile, and absolutely terrifying in the hands of someone who knew how to use them. A Danish axe could split a man from shoulder to hip, though medieval combat manuals rarely included specific instructions for such applications. Behind the housecarls stood the feared, militia forces drawn from the countryside, who'd been practicing weekend warrior activities until recent events had transformed them into full-time soldiers with limited job security. The feared were farmers, craftsmen, and various other civilians who'd discovered that military service was significantly more demanding than their previous occupations and considerably more likely to result in premature career termination. The English position stretched across the ridge for approximately 400 yards, with Harold's golden fighting man standard planted at the highest point to ensure that everyone could see where their king stood. Medieval battlefield communications were primarily visual, relying on banners, horn calls, and the sort of gestural communication that worked reasonably well until someone lost sight of the relevant flags. William's army approached Senlac Hill with the methodical precision that characterized Norman military operations. The Norman force was organized in 3 divisions: Bretons on the left, Normans in the centre, and French forces on the right. This multinational arrangement reflected William's successful recruitment efforts and probably created interesting linguistic challenges during tactical coordination. The Norman army was built around heavy cavalry, the medieval equivalent of tank warfare. Norman knights rode destriers, massive war horses bred specifically for combat, wearing mail armor and carrying weapons designed to break infantry formations through a combination of speed, weight, and pointed steel. The sight of a cavalry charge was intended to be psychologically devastating, assuming the enemy hadn't developed specific countermeasures like shield walls and Danish axes. Supporting the cavalry were Norman archers and infantry, including crossbowmen, whose weapons could penetrate armor at considerable distances. Medieval crossbows were the medieval equivalent of sniper rifles, accurate, powerful, and requiring significantly more time to reload than you'd prefer during active combat. The combination of archers, infantry, and cavalry gave William tactical flexibility that Harold's primarily infantry force couldn't match. The battle began with Norman archers advancing up the slope and loosing volleys of arrows into the English shield wall. This was standard medieval battlefield procedure. Start with missile weapons, assess enemy response, then adjust tactics accordingly. The English responded by raising their shields and enduring the arrow storm with the sort of grim professionalism that suggested they'd done this before. The initial archery exchange was inconclusive, which in medieval terms meant that people were dying but not in sufficient numbers to affect the tactical situation. The English shield wall held firm, and Norman arrows either stuck in shields or sailed harmlessly overhead, creating the medieval equivalent of an expensive but ineffective fireworks display. William's response to the archery stalemate was characteristically direct. He ordered a cavalry charge. Norman knights spurred their horses up the slope toward the English line, which created the sort of spectacular visual display that medieval chroniclers found irresistible, and English defenders found considerably less entertaining. The cavalry charge struck the shield wall with tremendous force and precisely zero effect. The English formation held, horses refused to charge directly into overlapping shields, and Norman knights found themselves in the awkward position of sitting on increasingly nervous destriers, while English axes reached up to explain why cavalry charges against prepared infantry were generally inadvisable. Medieval war horses were trained for combat, but they weren't suicidal. A horse charging toward a line of shields and spears would typically stop short, leaving its rider in range of enemy weapons, but without the momentum needed to break the defensive line. This created tactical complications that Norman training hadn't adequately addressed, possibly because Norman training assumed that enemies would be more cooperative about being conquered. The first Norman cavalry assault failed completely, with knights retreating down the slope, while English defenders shouted encouragement that probably wasn't particularly encouraging. The retreat turned into a rout when rumours spread that William had been killed, which created the sort of army-wide panic that medieval commanders worked very hard to prevent. William's response to his army's sudden crisis of confidence was both dramatic and effective. He rode into the middle of his retreating forces, removed his helmet and shouted something along the lines of, "Look at me, I'm not dead." This was either inspired battlefield leadership or evidence that medieval crisis management involved a lot of shouting and dramatic gesturing. The sight of their living duke rallied the Norman forces, who returned to the business of trying to break the English shield wall through creative applications of violence. William's survival became a crucial morale factor, demonstrating that rumours of ducal death were greatly exaggerated and that Norman conquest plans remained operationally viable. The battle settled into a grinding pattern of assault and repulse, with Norman forces repeatedly charging up the slope, only to be turned back by the English defensive line. This was the medieval equivalent of siege warfare fought in the open field, methodical, exhausting, and ultimately dependent on who could maintain their formation longer under continuous pressure. Hours passed with neither side achieving decisive advantage. The English held their ground, but the shield wall gradually contracted as casualties mounted and fatigue accumulated. The Normans maintained their offensive pressure, but repeated failed assaults were taking their toll on both morale and horse availability. Medieval battles were often wars of attrition, disguised as tactical engagements. The turning point came when the Normans executed what was either a planned tactical maneuver or a fortunate accident that later historians would describe as tactical genius. A portion of the Norman cavalry began retreating down the slope, which prompted some English defenders to break formation and pursue, because apparently the concept of feigned retreat wasn't covered in basic feared training. The Norman retreat was actually a carefully orchestrated trap. Once the pursuing English forces had descended from their defensive position, the retreating cavalry turned and counterattacked while fresh Norman forces struck the exposed English troops from the flanks. This was medieval tactical innovation at its finest, using your opponent's tactical discipline against them by creating situations where discipline became disadvantageous. The English forces that had broken formation were cut off and destroyed, creating gaps in the shield wall that Norman cavalry could exploit. The defensive line that had held firm for hours began to crack under coordinated pressure, and Harold's army faced the medieval equivalent of structural failure during a hurricane. As the afternoon wore on, the English position became increasingly precarious. The shield wall had been punctured in several places, casualties were mounting, and the tactical advantages of the defensive position were being eroded by Norman persistence and tactical innovation. Harold's army was learning the hard way that static defense against mobile offense was a losing proposition in the long term. The climax of the battle came as arrows began falling like medieval rain. William had ordered his archers to shoot high, sending their missiles arcing over the heads of his own troops to fall among the English defenders. This was either tactical innovation or the medieval equivalent of suppressing fire, depending on your perspective on battlefield archery. According to the Bayeux Tapestry and various contemporary accounts, Harold was struck in the eye by one of these high-trajectory arrows. Whether this actually happened or was simply convenient Norman propaganda is debated by historians, but the result was the same. England's king fell on the field of battle, and with him fell the last effective resistance to Norman conquest. Harold's death had the predictable effect on English morale, which collapsed faster than a poorly constructed medieval bridge during spring flooding. The sight of their king's golden fighting man standard falling was the medieval equivalent of watching your team's quarterback carried off the field, psychologically devastating and tactically decisive. The English army, which had fought magnificently for nearly 8 hours, finally broke and fled. Some retreated toward London, others scattered into the surrounding countryside, and a few made stands at various defensive positions where they could sell their lives at premium prices to pursuing Norman cavalry. The Normans, exhausted by their hard-fought victory, began the traditional post-battle activities, tending wounded, counting dead, and beginning the administrative process of conquest. William had won his battle and earned his crown, but he still needed to convince the rest of England that Norman rule was preferable to continued resistance. The Battle of Hastings was over, but the Norman conquest had only just begun. William had defeated Harold's army and eliminated the primary focus of English resistance, but transforming military victory into political control would require additional effort, different skills, and probably significantly more paperwork than battlefield command. The field of Senlac Hill was littered with the evidence of medieval warfare, broken weapons, abandoned equipment, and the sort of battlefield debris that made scavenging a profitable but unpleasant occupation. The dead included Harold and his brothers, most of his housecarls, and a significant portion of the English military leadership that might have organised continued resistance. William's victory was complete, but it had been purchased at considerable cost. Norman casualties were substantial, horses had been lost in large numbers, and the invasion force was significantly reduced from its original strength. Medieval conquest was expensive in terms of both material and human resources, requiring careful management of limited assets. As night fell on October 14, 1066, England was in the unusual position of having a vacant throne and a Norman duke with strong opinions about who should fill it. The battle that had begun as a succession dispute between Harold and William had ended with Harold dead and William in possession of the field, which in medieval legal terms represented a fairly conclusive arbitration of the succession question. The survivors of Harold's army retreated into a countryside that would soon learn the practical implications of Norman governance. The peasants who had woken up that morning as subjects of King Harold II would go to sleep as potential subjects of Duke William, assuming William could transform his battlefield victory into the sort of comprehensive political control that medieval kingship required. Medieval battles were often decisive, but medieval conquests required sustained effort over months and years. William had won the crucial first step, but the transformation of England from Saxon kingdom to Norman realm would demand different talents, different strategies, and the sort of administrative competence that made successful conquests more than temporary military occupations. The Norman Conquest had begun with Edward the Confessor's failure to produce an heir, and would continue with William's efforts to transform military success into political legitimacy. The Battle of Hastings had settled the question of who would rule England, but it hadn't yet determined what sort of country Norman England would become. The final hours of the Battle of Hastings unfolded with the sort of inexorable momentum that characterises both natural disasters and medieval political transitions. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Sussex horizon, the English shield wall, which had held firm through hours of Norman assault, finally began to show the cracks that would ultimately shatter Saxon England. The English defensive line had been magnificent in its stubborn persistence. For the better part of 8 hours, Harold's forces had demonstrated that well-disciplined infantry with advantageous terrain could hold their own against Norman cavalry, Breton enthusiasm, and French tactical innovation. The shield wall had absorbed charge after charge, creating what amounted to a medieval version of trench warfare, conducted entirely above ground, with significantly more personal interaction between opposing forces. But medieval battles, like medieval sieges, were ultimately wars of attrition. The English advantage had been their defensive position and their superior knowledge of local geography. The Norman advantage had been their tactical flexibility, their superior equipment, and their ability to rotate fresh troops into combat, while the English were forced to maintain their line with increasingly exhausted defenders. The decisive factor proved to be the Norman innovation of high-trajectory archery. William's archers, frustrated by the ineffectiveness of direct shooting against the English shield wall, began loosing their arrows in high arcs that carried over the heads of their own advancing infantry and cavalry. This created what medieval military theorists would later recognize as indirect fire, though they probably didn't use such technical terminology. The result was that arrows began falling among the English defenders like a particularly violent hailstorm. The shield wall, designed to protect against frontal assault, offered limited protection against missiles arriving from above. English defenders found themselves dealing with the medieval equivalent of mortar fire, unpredictable, difficult to defend against, and psychologically unsettling, even when it didn't cause direct casualties. Harold's position at the centre of the English line made him a natural target for both direct assault and indirect archery. As king, he was obligated to remain visible to his troops, which meant standing in the most dangerous part of the battlefield, while wearing the sort of distinctive royal regalia that made enemy targeting significantly easier. Medieval leadership involved considerable occupational hazards. The famous account of Harold's death, struck in the eye by a Norman arrow, comes primarily from the Bayeux Tapestry, which serves as our most detailed visual record of the battle, but was commissioned by Norman victors who had their own perspective on appropriate historical documentation. Whether Harold was actually killed by an arrow to the eye, cut down by Norman cavalry, or died from some combination of battlefield injuries is less important than the fact that he died messily and definitively on the field of battle. What we know for certain is that Harold's death occurred during the final phase of the battle, when the English line was already beginning to crack under sustained pressure. His fall was witnessed by enough people on both sides to become an established historical fact, though the specific details of his death were probably embellished by later chroniclers, who appreciated dramatic narrative more than clinical accuracy. The sight of Harold falling had the predictable effect on English morale. Medieval armies depended heavily on the visible presence of their leaders, and the death of a king was the medieval equivalent of cutting the head off a snake, immediately disruptive and ultimately fatal to organized resistance. The golden fighting man standard that had marked Harold's position throughout the battle fell with him, providing visual confirmation to every English soldier that their cause was literally and figuratively without leadership. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine had also fallen during the battle, eliminating the Godwinson family's leadership in what amounted to a complete dynasty termination event. The 3 deaths removed not just the current English leadership, but also the most obvious candidates for continued resistance, creating the sort of leadership vacuum that made conquest significantly easier for the victors. The collapse of English leadership was followed immediately by the collapse of English resistance. The shield wall, which had maintained its integrity through hours of assault, finally disintegrated. as individual soldiers began calculating their personal survival odds and reaching conclusions that favoured immediate departure over continued military service. Medieval military discipline depended heavily on shared confidence in eventual victory, and Harold's death had eliminated that confidence with clinical efficiency. The English retreat began in the centre and spread rapidly to both flanks, creating what military historians politely call tactical withdrawal, and what participants probably called running away as fast as possible while trying not to get killed by Norman cavalry. The retreat quickly became a rout, as Norman forces, sensing victory, pursued with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for collecting long overdue debts. Some English forces made organised retreats, falling back in good order, while maintaining unit cohesion and defensive formations. Others simply scattered into the Sussex countryside, carrying news of Harold's death and Norman victory to communities that would soon discover the practical implications of regime change. The difference between organised retreat and panicked flight often determined whether individual soldiers survived to see another day. Norman pursuit was hampered by exhaustion, casualties, and the practical difficulties of chasing scattered enemies across unfamiliar terrain as daylight faded. Medieval cavalry was most effective against formed infantry in open ground. Pursuing individual fugitives through woods and marshes was significantly more difficult and considerably less profitable than systematic battlefield victory. Some English defenders made final stands at various defensive positions, including what chroniclers called the Malfosse, a ravine or earthwork where retreating English forces turned to fight pursuing Normans. These last-ditch defensive actions were probably motivated more by desperation than strategy, but they demonstrated that English resistance hadn't been entirely eliminated by Harold's death, merely decentralised and rendered tactically ineffective. The Malfosse incident, assuming it actually occurred as described, represented the medieval equivalent of a tactical reversal during the pursuit phase. Norman cavalry, pursuing scattered English forces in failing light, apparently rode into a prepared position where English defenders were able to inflict casualties on their pursuers. This sort of reversal was common during medieval pursuits, when victorious forces became careless and defeated forces found opportunities for revenge. William's response to reports of continuing English resistance was characteristically thorough. Rather than risk his victory through overconfident pursuit, he consolidated his forces and began the methodical process of securing the battlefield and counting the costs of victory. Medieval conquest required careful resource management, and William understood that maintaining his reduced army was more important than eliminating every last English soldier. The Norman victory at Hastings was complete but expensive. William's forces had suffered substantial casualties, particularly among the cavalry that formed the core of Norman tactical doctrine. Horses had been killed in large numbers, which in medieval terms represented both tactical and economic losses. Medieval destriers were expensive, trained assets that couldn't be quickly replaced, and their loss reduced Norman military capability for future operations. The battlefield itself bore witness to the intensity of the fighting. Contemporary accounts describe fields littered with weapons, armour, and the sort of battlefield debris that made scavenging both profitable and unpleasant. The dead included not just Harold and his brothers, but much of the English military leadership that might have organised continued resistance in other parts of the country. Harold's body was reportedly found among the dead after considerable searching, which suggests that royal identification was complicated by the general battlefield conditions and possibly by the effects of Norman tactical enthusiasm. Medieval battlefield medicine was limited, and the distinction between dead and seriously wounded was often clarified by time rather than immediate medical assessment. The identification of Harold's remains became important for both political and practical reasons. William needed to confirm that his primary rival was actually dead rather than merely wounded, and planning comeback strategies from some convenient hiding place. Medieval royal deaths needed to be verified to prevent later complications involving impostors, resurrection claims, and the sort of succession disputes that had started the entire conflict. William's treatment of Harold's body was reportedly respectful, which served both diplomatic and propaganda purposes. By honouring his defeated rival, William demonstrated magnanimity in victory and suggested that Norman rule would be characterised by appropriate royal dignity. Medieval political theatre often involved symbolic gestures that conveyed important messages about future governance policies. The Norman celebration of victory was subdued by medieval standards, partly because the army was exhausted and partly because William understood that winning a battle was only the first step in conquering a kingdom. Medieval victories required careful follow-up to transform military success into political control, and William's experience in Norman politics had taught him that premature celebration often preceded unexpected complications. As night fell on October 14, 1066, the Norman forces established a fortified camp on the battlefield and began planning their next moves. William had achieved his primary military objective, the defeat of Harold's army and the elimination of the main English leadership, but transforming this tactical success into strategic control of England would require different skills and considerable additional effort. The English survivors of Hastings scattered throughout the countryside, carrying news of Harold's death and Norman victory to communities that would soon face the practical reality of conquest. Some would organise local resistance, others would seek accommodation with the new Norman authorities, and many would simply try to continue their lives under whatever government seemed likely to tax them next. The Battle of Hastings had ended with Norman victory, but the Norman conquest was only beginning. William had eliminated Harold and defeated the primary English army, but England contained numerous potential sources of resistance, including other claimants to the throne, regional nobles with their own armies, and a population that might not immediately appreciate the benefits of Norman governance. The medieval conquest was a process rather than an event, requiring sustained effort over months and years to transform military victory into stable political control. William had won the crucial first battle, but the transformation of England from Saxon kingdom to Norman realm would demand diplomatic skill, administrative competence, and the sort of persistent effort that separated successful conquerors from temporary battlefield victors. The sun set on Saxon England on October 14, 1066, but it would rise on a country that didn't yet know what Norman England would become. The battle was over, the king was dead, and William of Normandy had earned the right to explain to the English people why Norman rule would be an improvement over their previous political arrangements. The medieval sales pitch was about to begin, backed by cavalry and supported by siege engines. William's victory at Hastings had earned him the right to call himself King of England, but medieval kingship required more than battlefield success. Claiming a crown and keeping it were two entirely different propositions, especially when the crown in question belonged to a kingdom that hadn't specifically requested new management and might have strong opinions about foreign administration. The immediate aftermath of Hastings found William in the somewhat awkward position of having conquered an army without yet conquering a country. Harold was dead, the primary English military force was scattered, and Norman cavalry controlled a small portion of Sussex, but the rest of England remained unconvinced that regime change was either necessary or desirable. Medieval conquest required a comprehensive marketing campaign, preferably backed by siege engines. William's first priority was consolidating his position around the battlefield while allowing his exhausted forces time to recover from their victory. Medieval armies, even victorious ones, required rest, resupply and medical attention after major battles. The Norman force that had crossed the Channel in September was significantly reduced by the campaign's casualties, and William needed to husband his remaining strength carefully. The Norman duke, he wasn't quite king yet, established his headquarters at Hastings and began the systematic process of demonstrating to the local population that resistance was futile, while cooperation was potentially profitable. This involved what medieval chroniclers politely called ravaging, which was essentially organised property redistribution conducted without excessive paperwork or prior consultation with the previous owners. Norman foraging operations expanded throughout southeastern England, serving multiple purposes beyond simple supply acquisition. The systematic destruction of crops, seizure of livestock, and general economic disruption demonstrated Norman power while creating incentives for local submission. Medieval psychological warfare often relied on practical demonstration rather than theoretical threats. Local resistance to Norman operations was minimal, partly because organised resistance requires organisation, and Harold's death had eliminated the most obvious source of English leadership. The earls, thegns and other English nobles who might have coordinated resistance were either dead at Hastings, scattered throughout the country, or carefully reconsidering their political loyalties in light of recent developments. Meanwhile, in London, the remaining English leadership was discovering the practical difficulties of succession planning under adverse circumstances. The Withan, England's Council of Nobles and Church leaders, faced the challenge of selecting a new king, while Norman cavalry was systematically explaining to Sussex residents why cooperation was preferable to resistance. The English leadership's first impulse was to choose Edgar the Atheling, the last remaining male heir of the old royal bloodline and Harold's designated successor. Edgar was young, legitimate, and thoroughly inexperienced in the sort of practical politics that involved repelling foreign invasions. He was the medieval equivalent of promoting someone to CEO during a hostile takeover, theoretically appropriate, but practically inadequate for current circumstances. Edgar's claim was genealogically sound, but militarily irrelevant. Medieval kingship ultimately depended on the ability to protect your subjects and defeat your enemies, and Edgar possessed neither the army nor the experience necessary for successful resistance against Norman conquest. His supporters recognized that legitimacy without force was roughly equivalent to theoretical sovereignty. The English political situation was further complicated by the absence of effective military leadership. Harold's death had eliminated not just the king, but also the most competent English commander, and his brothers' deaths had removed the most experienced military advisors. The remaining English nobility possessed individual authority, but lacked the collective leadership necessary for organizing comprehensive resistance. William, meanwhile, was pursuing a patient strategy designed to minimize resistance while maximizing the appearance of inevitability. Rather than marching directly on London, he advanced slowly through southeastern England, systematically reducing fortified positions and accepting the submission of local authorities. This approach demonstrated Norman strength, while providing opportunities for English leaders to surrender with dignity intact. The Norman advance was methodical rather than rushed, reflecting William's understanding that sustainable conquest required political accommodation as well as military success. Medieval kingdoms were complex political entities, and replacing one ruling dynasty with another required careful management of existing power structures, religious institutions, and regional loyalties. Canterbury submitted without resistance, which provided William with an important symbolic victory. The cathedral city was England's religious centre, and its peaceful surrender suggested that the English Church was prepared to accept Norman authority. Medieval conquest was significantly easier when religious leaders endorsed regime change, and Canterbury's submission provided valuable ecclesiastical legitimacy. Dover proved more challenging, with its garrison initially attempting resistance before recognizing that heroic last stands were more romantic in literature than in practice. The castle's eventual surrender provided William with a strategic stronghold commanding the Channel crossing, ensuring secure communications with Normandy and protecting his primary line of retreat if circumstances required hasty departure. William's treatment of surrendering English communities was calculated to encourage further submissions. Towns that capitulated without resistance were generally treated with restraint, while those that offered military opposition received the sort of attention that discouraged similar behaviour in neighbouring settlements. Medieval diplomacy often relied on practical demonstrations of the costs and benefits of various political choices. The psychological impact of Norman success was amplified by the systematic destruction accompanying their advance. English communities, watching smoke rise from distant settlements, received clear messages about the likely consequences of resistance, while witnessing the respectful treatment of cooperative neighbours demonstrated the benefits of accommodation. Medieval public relations involved more fire than modern campaigns, but followed similar logical principles. English resistance was further complicated by internal political divisions that had predated the Norman invasion. Regional rivalries, personal feuds, and competing claims to local authority made coordinated resistance difficult even under favourable circumstances. The crisis created by Harold's death exacerbated these existing tensions, making English political unity nearly impossible to achieve. London's position became increasingly precarious as Norman forces approached the city. The capital contained England's treasury, administrative centre, and largest concentration of military resources, but defending it against siege required the sort of unified leadership that was notably absent from English political circles. Medieval urban defence required both extensive preparation and sustained political commitment. The English leadership in London faced an impossible strategic situation. They lacked the military strength to defeat William in open battle, the political unity necessary for sustained resistance, and the time required to organize effective opposition. Medieval political crises often created circumstances where all available options were unsatisfactory, but decisions remained necessary. William's approach to London was carefully orchestrated to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing his own risks. Rather than attempting direct assault against prepared defences, he bypassed the city and established positions that cut off London's communications with potential supporters. This created a medieval version of strategic encirclement, isolating the target while avoiding costly frontal attacks. The encirclement strategy was psychologically devastating to English morale. London's leaders could see Norman forces controlling the surrounding countryside while recognizing their own inability to break the siege or receive external assistance. Medieval siege warfare often succeeded through psychological pressure rather than military assault, and William's approach demonstrated his understanding of these principles. English resolve finally cracked when leading nobles began approaching William with offers of submission. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Edgar the Atheling, and various earls and bishops arrived at William's camp seeking terms for peaceful surrender. Medieval diplomacy often involved the practical recognition that resistance was futile and negotiation was preferable to continued military action. The English delegation's submission was formal, comprehensive, and slightly humiliating. They offered William the crown of England, acknowledged his legitimacy as Edward's chosen successor, and requested his forgiveness for Harold's usurpation. Medieval diplomatic language was often elaborate, but the essential message was clear. England was prepared to accept Norman rule in exchange for merciful treatment of the existing political establishment. William's response was gracious in victory, which served both his immediate political needs and his long-term governance requirements. He accepted the submission with appropriate royal dignity, promised to rule England according to its traditional laws and customs, and generally behaved like someone who understood that successful conquest required political integration rather than mere military domination. The coronation was scheduled for Christmas Day, 1066, which provided appropriate religious symbolism while allowing time for necessary preparations. Medieval coronations were complex ceremonial events requiring extensive coordination between religious and secular authorities, and William's coronation needed to demonstrate both divine approval and political legitimacy to English and Norman audiences. Westminster Abbey was selected as the coronation site, which provided historical continuity with previous English coronations, while offering sufficient space for the elaborate ceremony required to establish Norman legitimacy. The choice of venue was politically significant, demonstrating William's intention to rule as King of England rather than as a Norman governor of occupied territory. The coronation ceremony itself became memorable for reasons that medieval event planners hadn't anticipated. When the Archbishop of York asked the assembled congregation to acknowledge William as their rightful king, the enthusiastic response apparently startled the Norman guards posted outside the abbey. Medieval crowd control hadn't yet developed sophisticated protocols for distinguishing between acclamation and riot. The guards' response to what they interpreted as hostile activity was characteristically Norman. They began setting fire to nearby buildings. This created the sort of dramatic backdrop for royal coronation that was probably not covered in contemporary ceremonial handbooks. Medieval crisis management often involved improvisation under challenging circumstances. Despite the unplanned architectural excitement, the coronation proceeded to completion, with William officially becoming King of England on December 21, 1066. The ceremony provided the religious and legal foundation for Norman rule, while demonstrating that English institutions would continue under new management. Medieval political transitions often involved more continuity than change, despite the violence required to achieve them. William's coronation marked the formal beginning of Norman England, but the practical transformation of the kingdom would require years of sustained effort. Medieval conquest involved not just defeating existing rulers, but replacing them with new administrative systems, legal structures, and cultural institutions. The coronation was the beginning of this process, not its completion. The immediate aftermath of coronation involved the practical business of establishing government, appointing administrators, and managing the complex transition from military occupation to civil administration. William needed to reward his Norman followers while accommodating English nobles, satisfy church leaders while maintaining papal support, and generally demonstrate that Norman rule would be both effective and legitimate. Norman settlement patterns reflected William's understanding that successful conquest required integration rather than replacement. Some English nobles were confirmed in their holdings, others were replaced with Norman administrators, and many were incorporated into a new feudal hierarchy that combined Norman military organisation with English agricultural expertise. Medieval political engineering often involved creative combinations of existing and imported institutions. The transformation of England proceeded gradually but inexorably throughout William's reign. Norman French became the language of government and law, stone castles replaced wooden fortifications, and feudal military service supplanted Anglo-Saxon military obligations. These changes occurred over decades rather than months, reflecting the complex process of cultural integration required for successful conquest. The English resistance continued sporadically throughout William's early reign, but it was localized, uncoordinated, and ultimately ineffective against Norman administrative efficiency and military superiority. Medieval rebellion required both popular support and effective leadership, and William's political arrangements had eliminated most potential sources of organized opposition. The Norman conquest was complete in military terms by the end of 1066, but its cultural and political implications would continue developing for generations. William had successfully transformed a Norman dynastic claim into English royal authority. But the England he ruled was already becoming something different from either Norman Normandy or Saxon England. Medieval conquest was ultimately about transformation rather than replacement. William hadn't simply conquered England, he had created Norman England, a hybrid political entity that combined Norman administrative methods with English geographical and demographic realities. The result was neither purely Norman nor purely English, but something new that would shape English development for centuries to come. And so, as 1066 drew to a close, England settled into its new Norman reality with the sort of resigned acceptance that characterizes populations faced with irreversible political change. The peasants continued farming, the merchants continued trading, and the nobles continued plotting, but now everything occurred under Norman supervision, and with significantly more paperwork. The great succession crisis that had begun with Edward the Confessor's failure to produce an heir had been resolved through traditional medieval methods. Comprehensive violence, followed by administrative reorganization. England had learned the important lesson that succession planning was really important, though this knowledge came somewhat late to be practically useful. William I, King of England and Duke of Normandy, could finally relax in the knowledge that his dynastic ambitions had been achieved, his legal claims vindicated, and his investment in invasion ships profitably recovered. Medieval entrepreneurship was risky, but successful conquest offered excellent returns for those with sufficient startup capital and appropriate risk tolerance. The Norman conquest was complete, England was transformed, and medieval chroniclers began the long process of explaining to future generations how three men's competing claims to one throne had resulted in the complete reorganization of English society. It was the sort of historical lesson that suggested succession crises were best avoided through careful planning and adequate reproduction. Sleep well, dear listeners. Unless you're a Saxon noble still adjusting to Norman management practices, then maybe invest in some French language lessons and try to look enthusiastic about castle construction projects. Good night. Thank you for listening one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.